Welcome to this live cast on our future economies. Capitalism, despite the tremendous increase in worldwide welfare through its innovative power and freedom, has at the same time a number of negative consequences. A transition is necessary to overcome ecological destruction, decrease in quality of life, and growing inequality. Given geopolitical developments, Europe has an important role to play in this transition. In the livecasts, we will start an open dialogue and discuss this transition with internationally renowned economists from all over the world. Questions will pass by, such as: each week, we will discuss these matters with 2 economists, resulting in 10 online dialogues in 10 weeks, where we will share viewpoints and collect ideas on how capitalism's innovative and creative powers can go hand in hand with fostering an equal and just society. A different subject every week. Together we can build a basis for economies that are beneficial to all of us. You can participate by putting your questions and remarks in the chat. So, let's talk.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 3rd edition of the series, The Future of Capitalism, a series initiated and designed by Moral Markets in collaboration with Pakhuis de Zwijger. And today we talk about what else is necessary to have functioning markets, because more and more the realization is that markets are not self-contained systems, but need other social spheres to function well. Such spheres can be found in the government, but also in civil society or in local, national or global communities. The risk is that markets undermine these other spheres or even invade them too much. And we ask ourselves tonight, how can we restore the balance? How can we achieve a balance, and why is that necessary? What does it require from various spheres as pillars of a good market society? And in order to investigate that, research that question, we have invited 3 guests. We will start with a member of the think tank of young economists, Sam de Muijnck, and he will present an opening statement for this evening. And after that, my co-host David van Overbeek will interview 2 very important thinkers, global thinkers on this question. He will start with an interview with Raghuram Rajan, who is the Catherine Dusak Miller Distinguished Service Professor of Finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. And he was also governor of the Reserve Bank of India. And after that, he was also the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. It's great that he's here. He also co-authored 17 years ago a book which is really relevant for today's question, Saving Capitalism from the Capitalist. But his most recent work is the 3rd pillar, How Markets and the State Leave the Community Behind, a book we also have here on the table, and hopefully we can learn a lot from that. After that, David van Overbeek will interview the 3rd speaker of tonight, and we're so honored that he's here, Mr. Paul Collier. And he is a professor of economics and public policy at the Blavatnik School of Government and a professorial fellow at the St. Anthony's College at the University of Oxford. And he, in a 5 years public service leave, was the director of the Research Development Department of the World Bank. He is also currently a professor invité at Sciences Po and a director of the International Growth Center. Mr. Collier has written, of course, many articles in renowned magazines like New York Times, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal. But his 2 most recent books we will focus on. The first is The Future of Capitalism, Facing New Anxieties, and the second is just recently published, Greed is Dead. Welcome, gentlemen. It's an honor to have you here in this, although it's digital, same realm. After the interviews, we will have a public debate, and we ask our speakers to respond to each other. And we invite you, the audience, to contribute as well. And you can do that by joining us in our Zoom webinar environment. And if you're watching the live stream right now, you should go to the site of Pakhuis de Zwijger, and on the program page of tonight, you can enter the webinar of Zoom. And in there, you can ask through the Q&A button questions, and we will get them here. And you can also engage in the debate we have with our guests. Please do so. Because we don't want to have a television show, we really want to have a collaboration between us and the public. And since this is the third edition of this series, we know that you want this, because in the previous editions you asked a lot of questions. Use that possibility. Okay, so this is enough for the introduction. Let's kickstart this meeting. And I would like to ask you, with your full heart and mind, your intention for Sam de Muijnck.
Thank you. The topic of tonight is the revival of communities. Thank you. The topic of tonight is the revival of communities. Both Professor Collier and Professor Rajan argue that communities have collapsed over the last decades. Communities are defined as groups with a shared identity and mutual obligations. They can be a family, a village, or a neighborhood, and both speakers argue that these communities have been weakened because we have embraced individualism and broke social bonds. For long, human societies have been characterized by strong communities in which elites were embedded. But since the last decades, societies have more and more been shaped by competition by entitled individuals. Highly productive multinational corporations, cosmopolitan centers for the highly educated and the rich have emerged, but at the same time, provincial cities and rural areas have declined. Social inequality between different classes have increased. Power has been concentrated in the hands of a few corporations and individuals. Families have fallen apart as divorce rates have increased. Schools are crumbling and community organizations have disappeared. This is quite a bleak picture of the world today. As a young person, or as Paul Collier put it in his book to describe my generation, a youthful idiot, I grew up in the world they describe, and I recognize many of the things. I remember talking to my friends and my mother about how almost everyone was very self-centered and how there was very little that brought us together in a meaningful way. Trying to escape this feeling of loneliness, my friends and I organized our breakdance crew and made our own local community through breakdance. We didn't just dance together, it gave us a shared identity and social bonds that last to this day. And being part of this global breakdance community was very important for my personal development. This community, however, differs quite substantially from the typical post-war communities that are often referred to in the books. The world has changed over the last decades. We live in a more global and digital world, and traditional gender and ethnic hierarchies have been weakened, although not disappeared, just to name a few developments. My question, therefore, is, what kind of societies do we want or aim to develop? And how will they be different from the typical post-war communities? An important aspect in this, for me, seems to be how we can value the crucial work that is needed for communities. Whether it's teaching or care work, this kind of work has often been undervalued and gendered, sometimes being referred to as pink-collar jobs. If someone today wants to be successful, recognized, rewarded, choosing this kind of a job is probably not the best option. What can we do to change this? Secondly, how can we expect new communities to develop and emerge? Or in other words, what's our theory of change? It seems to me there are three, but possibly more answers, and obviously combinations of them. One option is to prioritize the economic situation of communities. In this answer, the problem lies fundamentally in technological change and bad economic policies. The solution, therefore, is good economic policy, which aims to reduce regional inequalities. This can be done through place-based policies, as it is known, that enable declined communities to recover economically and become a successful part of the global economy with the help of funds from the prospering cosmopolitan areas. Another option, however, is to emphasize cultural changes. In this answer, the reason communities have collapsed is not that economic activities and resources disappeared, but that individuals or people became their behavior and thinking became more individualist. The solution, therefore, according to this logic, lies in a societal debate about our identity and culture rather than in economic policy. And finally, another option seems to be to put the emphasis on the geographical level in which economic and/or political life happens. The problem that in this, according to this logic, is that too many processes, economic or political, have moved up from the local to the national or even global level. The main solution, according to this logic, is to localize our societies. Political power should be decentralized, and/or economic globalization should be undone by making supply chains local. I wonder how both Professor Rajan and Professor Collier think about these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam de Muijnck. Let's go to the first interview by my co-host David van Overbeek, who will interview Professor Raghuram Rajan. The floor is yours.
Good evening, Professor Rajan. Thank you for being here tonight with us. I'd like to start off this conversation by diving a little bit into your latest book, The Third Pillar. In it, you write that people need to have a chance within the capitalist system, and that the moment they don't have that chance, they will rebel against it. You mentioned that a lot of populist friction we see these days has actually its roots in a capitalist system that is not working for everyone. Now let's start with the context of Europe. For whom has the capitalist system over the last few decades not worked within Europe?
Well, I mean, certainly, if you think about Europe itself, look at the high levels of youth unemployment, and you have to argue it's not working for the very young. Often that youth unemployment, if you look at Germany, for example, a very prosperous country, a lot of that youth unemployment is situated in East Germany, and East Germany, as we know, is the fount for many of these populist right-wing movements also. So I think there are groups that are today, have a fairly bleak future in Europe, and they're reacting, and clearly the system has failed them.
And are their voices neglected, or are they being heard?
It's a very good question. I mean, clearly they're trying to make their voices heard and sometimes trying to shock in order to get attention. But it is also the case that, some of this may be structural, and that is what I talk a lot in my book about. And to the questions we just heard, I mean, part of the problem is that we have centralized a lot of political power, of course, to different degrees across Europe. But the European project itself could be thought of as one which emphasizes harmonization between the different countries in Europe, a common set of regulations, all of which tend to increase the power in Brussels and decrease the power locally. I mean, if you think of Brexit, it's a cry for taking back control, as leaders of that movement suggested. But it's not just about taking back control from Brussels to London. It's about taking back control from London to the provinces and the cities and to the villages. So some of it is structural and maybe hard to change without reconceptualizing the idea of Europe What is it that we need to foster? And I would argue we need to foster movement, cross-border trade, cross-border movement of people, of ideas, of capital. But you don't need uniformity in order to do that.
Yes.
And that de-democratizes the system.
So before moving on to the European Union and what we can do about this problem, let's talk a little bit more about what the problem actually is. Because in your book, I'm glad you mentioned your book, because in it you mentioned that the ability for human society to flourish rests on three pillars, right? So the state, market, and communities. And you mentioned that over the last decades, we've seen that the markets and state have crushed the communities, so to say. So what do you mean by that exactly? What has happened?
Well, again, to simplify, three big forces, right? The markets themselves have grown across borders. They've integrated within. Markets within countries have integrated, and across countries have integrated. Now, what that means is that the forces of competition hit everywhere. And areas that hadn't been exposed to much competition earlier, now exposed to tremendous amounts of competition. So that's one force. Market forces are hitting everywhere. The second is the state itself has grown along with markets. Powers have, usually we think markets and the state are opposed to each other. This was a big debate in the 20th century, one fighting the other. But in fact, if you look at it, they grow together often. And as markets have grown, the power of the state has grown, but it's also moved up to the capital, to the international level, because international markets are easier to control internationally. I mean, think, for example, I was a central banker. Where are capital decisions, bank capital decisions made? Not in national capitals, but in Basel. That's where they're made. So decisions have gotten elevated. So both the growth of the government as well as the growth in markets, what's left behind? The community, which is one, affected by the market forces. Paul talks a lot about depressed communities and how social ills start coming in. But they've also don't have the powers or the funding to make a change, because that has been elevated to national levels. So they're disempowered, but they have to actually adapt, and they don't have the ability to adapt, which creates frustration and therefore the desire for some kind of an alternative, which is what we're seeing now.
Yeah. Very clear. So what is the role of technology within this all that you mentioned?
Well, this is a global phenomenon, and so one of the questions is what is global about it? Why do you see the rise of anxiety in the Hindu majority in India, as well as in the white majority in the United States? What's common? And I would say two things are probably common. One is an idea. The idea of egalitarianism, the idea that hitherto disadvantaged communities, oppressed communities deserve more equality. So there's a push from the bottom for more equal status, which obviously to some extent creates anxiety amongst the establishment. But the other is technology which is making it possible for a whole variety of areas that weren't subject to competition, that wasn't subject to concerns earlier, to now be subject. And typically this also means the occupations amongst the majority is under threat. And so given that, one, the push from bottom up for greater political rights, greater social equality, and the push across the world of technology, making it possible to even out, essentially creates a tension which you see reflected in some of these movements.
Yes. And has this led to social stratification as well?
Absolutely, because one of the things that's going on in a really competitive world is, survival of the fittest. And everybody wants to be in that list of fittest, because the fittest earn far more. Ordinary, moderate, middle-income jobs have disappeared. You've got a lot of jobs at the low end, a lot of jobs at the very high end. Everyone wants their kids in Harvard, in Oxford, in the best universities. And to get there, they have to go to the best schools. And to get to the best schools, they have to move to the richest, most prosperous communities, because, again, this is a place where Paul and I agree. one of the strongest sort of indicators of a good education is the people you're surrounded with, because they're going to demand more of the teachers. You're going to learn more from them. You're going to do much better. And so we all move away from the traditional community. It is basically a flight of the most capable, which leaves the community much more impoverished.
So moving on to the solution you address within your book, you speak about inclusive localism. Sorry, what do you mean by that exactly?
Well, on the one hand, localism means try and develop more solutions locally, which means first start empowering the locality far more. Principle of subsidiarity that take decisions at the lowest level consistent with their efficient decision making. One example is Switzerland, which has national institutes of technology are governed by the federal government. The high schools are governed by the cantons, of which there are 26. And the primary school is governed by the municipality, of which there are 3,000. So at the early stage, the community, which is the municipality, has a lot of ability to influence what you learn and how you learn. And that is a good thing, because your values are embedded in that, and the community itself feels a sense of empowerment. So empowerment is important. That's one part of localism. Of course, in broken communities, you have to think about who to empower, how to create that movement which will lead to development. In many ways, communities have a problem of development, which, as Paul and I know from the international experience, is a very hard problem to solve. But the other aspect I think there's hope. There are lots of communities that have come out from fairly damaging situations, one of which I describe in the book, the Pilsen community in Chicago, which was in the middle of a gang war and built itself up today so that many people want to live there. But apart from the fact that you want localism, this goes to the questions that were asked earlier. That localism has to be inclusive. The earlier idea of communities was these would be hierarchical, these would be parochial, these would be segregationist. In the United States, for example, the idea of states' rights is often invoked by the segregationists, the racists who didn't want the benefits to go to the African-American population. So you have to combat that. And that is why I think it's very important to emphasize the inclusive also. We're talking about inclusive communities bound by ideas, bound by big projects, and not bound just by the color of their skin.
So can communities really be localized again when, for example, the ubiquitous smartphone is all around us and offers us instant access to anywhere, everywhere we want?
Well, technology has many sides to it, right? So you can sort of have photos of a family each on their smartphone and not talking to each other. At the same time, I know my kids keep in much greater touch with their colleagues from school, even though they all live in different cities, because they have Facebook pages for their group. They meet more often physically because of that. So it really depends on how you use it. Technology doesn't come with values attached. It's the values you impose on technology which allow you to go in a particular direction. And so what I think we need to do is, and we will, perhaps as a result of the experience with the pandemic, rediscover that we are social animals, and that we need to work on building our community because when a pandemic hits, we find that we really need it. We need those ties across people.
So latest question for you, Mr. Rajan. Who has to take the lead on this transformation? Can we just be rest assured about the strength of communities, or does the government need to have a leading role within this?
Well, I think lots of players have to play a part. I don't want to emphasize the government because in a sense, I'm saying that what we need is more decentralization. So a centralized authority imposing decentralization is somewhat a contradiction in terms. what we do need is certainly some government support to these efforts. I've talked about funding. I talk about empowering the local areas. Some governments have tried, some will do more. But we also need a bottom-up movement, a sense amongst people, and I see this in every country, a sense that, we have grown apart. We want to come back together. Let us create community gardens. Let us create community kitchens in order that we find a place we can meet, given that we've sort of professionalized so much and there's so few areas we actually do meet today, unlike in the past. So I think humans do recreate social structures, whether it's the parent-teacher association because they want to meet around the school, or so many other ways that we try and create these groups. I think we need to realize this is really important, especially if we are to deal with the diseases of the future, one of which is the loneliness of the elderly, which is growing in a really big way.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Rajan. Really looking forward to, within a discussion, to discuss a little bit more about this tension that you mentioned between empowering a movement of decentralization. But let's move on to Mr. Collier for now. Or Professor Collier, I should say. Thank you very much for joining us here tonight, Mr. Collier. Together with Professor Kay, you recently wrote a book titled Greed is Dead, which is an apt play, of course, on the infamous words of Gordon Gekko. In it, you mentioned that greed is no longer intellectually tenable. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you're quite right. We're not saying at the moment we got rid of greed. We're saying we're at peak greed. We're at peak greed because the ideas which justified greed, which was the rise of individualism, and especially a misinterpretation of what capitalism is about, those ideas are no longer really tenable. So we go back to the workhorse of economics, which is economic man, a creature, rather unattractive creature, conjured up in the 1950s. It's, in many respects, it's a very useful workhorse, but it was a drastic oversimplification of human nature. And economists at the time, in the 50s, really picked up on an exaggerated form of Darwinism, which said human beings are greedy and selfish, and really not much else. And if we're greedy and selfish, and smart, definitely smart. We overemphasize the smart bit. Homo sapiens, clever. And so if that was all we were, clever and greedy and selfish, you wanted the cleverest people at the top, so you needed these fantastically smart chief executives to run businesses and to run the state. And then you needed to try and get them to stop working just for themselves. So you needed to tie their performance to everything you could, basically to the profits of the firm. And then they faced the problem that under them, all they could recruit was workers who were also greedy and selfish, but less smart. And so what you do, economics came to the rescue, principal agent theory, designed in Oxford, which was monitor, scrutinize, and tie carrots and penalties to scrutinize performance. That was the working model. It became hugely influential. And that really took all power of decision up to the top. The chief executive knew best. And beneath that, you try to turn people as near to automator as possible. And so increasingly, that's how firms were run. And then in the 90s, the public sector started to ape the private sector. If that's so good for the private sector, we better do it too. And certainly in my own country of Britain, we transformed the public sector into that model of the top knows best, monitor, incentivize, scrutinize everybody else. And so that stripped ordinary people of the power of autonomy and decision. We ceased to be morally load-bearing agencies. We became these awful creatures. Why is all that untenable? Apart from being disgusting, it's factually wrong. Modern evolutionary biology comes up with a very different picture of what is human nature. As Professor Rajan was saying, we're designed to be very distinctive mammals. We're pro-social, much more so than other mammals. We're creative, we're imaginative. The fuel of capitalism isn't greed, it's common purpose in a team which has the autonomy to experiment and innovate. That's the fuel of capitalism. The genius of capitalism is decentralization within a certain discipline of competition, and the ability to come together. In Greed is Dead, we've got a lovely example of Airbus. Airbus is a huge cooperation, just like an iPhone is, a cooperation between an awful lot of firms. No one knows how to make an Airbus. No one knows how to make an iPhone. It's distributed knowledge across a lot of different teams, all of which have had the power to come up with creativity and ideas. But that depends upon decentralizing. So we've been trapped in a very dysfunctional model.
Yeah. Well, that's a very comprehensive answer, Mr. Collier. I think that's a very apt part of your, it's actually the entire book you just mentioned in a couple of minutes. So what more questions can I ask? But I have, if I understand you correctly, this idea of economic man, is that kind of a view on humanity or fellow men, which has been conjured up in the 1950s, a certain Darwinistic outlook on life, and this view on humanity has shaped our beliefs over the last few decades, the way we look at ourselves, the way we look at society. Do I understand you correctly?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very useful model for some purposes. It just got way above its pay grade. And so I believe in simplifying wherever possible. And so for some purposes, it's a very handy simplification. But it's been applied to everything. And that's where it became damaging. I mean, what you haven't yet talked about is the community stuff that indeed Professor Rajan talked about, and which is basically the subject of the Future of Capitalism as well. These spatial and new class divides between a booming metropolis and broken cities, between the rising value of people with a good tertiary education who went into fancy skills that became more and more valuable, like lawyers and bankers, versus the people with less education who specialized in manual skills, which have become less and less valuable. Now, as Professor Rajan says, the globalization of markets, which produces a lot of economic benefit overall, produces both winners and losers. The business of public policy is to offset those losses, not reverse globalization, that would be dumb, but design policies which offset the losses. We failed to do that. We failed drastically. And so technology and globalization, which should have led to all boats rising, they're wonderful things. Living standards could be rising at about 2% a year, probably. Instead, major groups of people are very, very fearful of the future. The young, the old, and the manual workers. Yeah. They're the most fearful groups. And of course, they mutiny in various ways. Who benefits from this? The people who spotted the mutinies earliest, which is the mavericks. mavericks of the left, like Corbyn in Britain, mavericks of the right, like Trump. The one thing that the mavericks have in common is they're selling snake oil. And so the dispossessed are stuck with snake oil, and meanwhile the successful have peeled off from their obligations to others because they created a new identity, an identity of the successful. And they identify with each other, not with fellow citizens. And that peeling off of the successful. So if the unsuccessful, the defining characteristic is snake oil, the defining characteristic of the successful is smug. There's a complacency that says, we're all right and you don't matter. And that disgusting distancing from obligations to others in society, that has been the real tragedy around our own societies.
So have both elites on, say, the left side of the political spectrum and the right side of the political spectrum, so to say, free-rided on the strength of communities over the last decades?
Strength of community has gradually been fading. Yeah. It was the secret source that a lot of societies inherited after the Second World War, and that led to a quarter century from about 1945 to 1970, which was an astonishing era of success. People were experienced in bearing obligations. They'd just fought a war together. They'd struggled together. And so politicians were addressing the anxieties of ordinary people, and the technology and the trade was producing a lot of potential for mutual success. And so, indeed, that was a period when all boats were rising. If we look back on that, it was a period of remarkable achievements at every level. Global common purpose, that was the period of the IMF, where Professor Rajan worked, the World Bank, where I work. So global common purpose and the formation of Europe as a common entity. It was an astonishing period of achievement. And then it all started to fall apart. It fell apart with the rise of individualism, the peeling off of the successful, the departure of politics from being about practical anxieties into disputes about ideology between factions of the elite. And so, despite the promise of rapid technology growth and all of globalization can deliver, what we've actually got is these deaths of despair and the fears of the young. The most in Europe, youth is even more fearful than in America, which is saying something.
Thank you, Mr. Collier. Let's move on to the discussion part of this of tonight.
Yeah. Thank you so much, both of you. And let me just start, of course, by giving Mr. Rajan the opportunity to respond to Mr. Collier, because you started, of course, with the interview with your ideas and on analysis. But of course, I can see that you were writing down a lot. So let me ask, whether you concur with Mr. Collier, and where is the difference in your analysis?
Oh, great question. So I'm going to give the American political answer, which I really believe in, which is what unites us is far more than what divides us on these issues. Very good. We actually think, Paul had his book out much earlier than I did. And I have to say, I take my word for it that I didn't read his book, but there is so much in common on the issues and the way we analyze them that I have to believe we're right. That there is, two people reach the same kind of analysis only if there's a fundamental sort of commonality. So I do sort of agree with a lot of what he has said, certainly what he said here. In the book, I mean, there are places where our emphasis probably differs a little bit, but maybe it's more if I'm trying to look for differences. Paul talks a lot more about the ideology, which I found very interesting. And I perhaps if I wrote my book again, I'd talk a little more about ideology. But the issue of rights and obligations, I thought that was very important, and how that breaks down as you leave the community and go to a broader setting. And perhaps that is one of the concerns that we see nowadays. I would, perhaps, I mean, my emphasis would be more in taking the questions that came initially, that the economics also changed. Now, what came first? Very hard to say, but the economics changed, which also pushed, therefore, on the community itself. I would also suggest that the structure of political power changed. And both these changes sort of reduced the room for the community. But I think these are, I think we both share these views. It's just how much emphasis we want to put on them. One point, if you want to look for differences, is on the corporation. I think Paul talks a lot about the purpose of the corporation, which I find is sort of an ennobling view of the corporation. But I think that, when we think about Friedman's shareholder value maximization, which often is blamed for all that's going wrong with corporations, you can actually get a lot of purpose within corporations if you do shareholder value maximization right. And I'm happy to talk about that at greater length. But purpose, it seems to me, is a better way of saying it. It enthuses more people. It enthuses the young. But there is a danger with saying purpose in an overly broad fashion if you bring corporations into the public realm and make them take up, governance objectives, take up some of the role of the government, because corporations, we don't have a check and balance system to allow them to do that. And so I would say the danger with some of these overly broad statements about purpose is it tends to get us away from what corporations do.
Well, last week we spoke to Mr. Meyer and Ms. Henderson about corporations and what we can do with them. And one of the analysis Ms. Henderson made, Rebecca Henderson was making, was that in order to reimagine the role of corporation, whether it be purpose or, is that we have to also reimagine the civic. Because without a strong civic society, civil society and civic institutions, you can never talk about a strong or a role of corporations. So we already explored that conversation last week, but interesting that you mentioned that is for you one of the differences of focus between you and Mr. Collier. What was interesting of course, there are two concepts which I really hope we can get clear this session, and that is what is meant exactly by community, how is it defined? Because if I talk to young people, they are talking about virtual global communities like Extinction Rebellion, or what is exactly meant if you both talk about community, and what role should communities play in reimagining Capitalism. And the other subject we can talk about later is your solution of inclusive localism, or the principle of subsidiarity, and how does that function in an economy? Is it all autarkic then, or are there other mechanisms in play? But so let's first go to, what do you exactly mean, the both of you, if you talk about community, and how do you define that?
Paul, you should go first.
Paul.
Okay. So,
Miss Professor Collier.
Yeah. So community is not is a woolly word, and let's see what we can say more specifically. Not any community is good. The communities which I think we need are what I would call adaptive and inclusive communities. So what they are able to achieve at their best is forging purposes that are genuinely common purposes, where everybody has agency in forging those purposes. And for that, we need dialogue within the community. Dialogue is a very particular form of communication. Dialogue is a conversation backwards and forwards between equals. So it can't occur top down. A hierarchy doesn't conduct a dialogue, it gives orders and instructions. So it's a peer-to-peer thing. It's backwards and forwards like ping pong, where people are searching out some common understanding, some in the process, some degree of common identity, which can sit comfortably with all their other identities. So it's not trying to crowd out other identities, but it's sort of common identity, common understanding, and from that you can forge common purpose, and all those together bring something that's truly valuable, which is common obligations. And that ability to forge common obligations to do some common purpose is the genius step that individualism can never achieve. Jean-Jacques Rousseau got there first with the idea that individual purposes, we're hungry, well, we can catch rabbits. If we can make that a collective purpose, we can all work together and catch stags. But to catch stags, it's a coordination problem, and that we need this common purpose and the glue that which brings common obligations. So that's a community. Let me just carry on a little bit. It needs to be adaptive and inclusive. Inclusive, obvious, plenty written about it, but let me say something about adaptive. Now, Professor Rajan and I haven't talked about this, so I don't know whether he buys into this idea or not, but having written a book with John Kay, I'm very keen on the concept of radical uncertainty, that we live in a world where we don't always know what to do. There are some problems, and we've hit it twice globally in the last 12 years, when the right answer to what should we do is, we don't know. In that case, you better find out. And if you're going to find out, that's where you need rapid adaptation, rapid learning, and experiments in parallel. And for that, what we need is devolved agency within communities, so that local teams, both in a place and within a company, local at the bottom, can actually experiment. And so with devolved power of decision, you get that automatically. If you start from the belief that the top knows best, you don't get experiments in parallel. You don't get the fusion of expert knowledge and the tacit knowledge that comes from experience.
Yeah.
And so there's a very powerful reason within a context of the need to learn, the need to devolve.
Yeah. Mr. Rajan. Perhaps you'd like to comment on that, and I'd like to add a follow-up question to that as well, because I think we've been circling around this for up to this time. This question, a bit fundamental question, perhaps. Why are communities so important for the economic well-being of a country? Because both authors seem to emphasize that there's a problem with communities, but why should we focus and address the issues with communities so much, and to the extent that they contribute to the economic well-being of a country as well? You both being economists, of course.
Yeah. So let me agree totally with the need to be adaptive, but I would add an additional sort of qualifier, which is locally sensitive. I mean, one of the beauties of the community is it understands which problems are important locally, and then it can tackle that, something that a centralized one-size-fits-all answer cannot. So in addition to the experimentation that Professor Collier points to, which is extremely important, that experimentation occurs under different conditions, and so you get a variety of answers. Now, I've certainly battled this idea of many people saying, these communities you're talking about don't exist anymore. We have virtual communities. One columnist told me my community consists of older white Jewish men, and that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about a community which I left 40 or 50 years ago. And the reality, though, is that if you look around, most people live in places that have local government. And I think one of the important aspects of the community that both Professor Collier and I talk about is how central local government can be to our life chances. The local schools that you go to. Today, if you make a mistake early on in life, it's very hard to catch up. That's what Professor Heckman at the University of Chicago has suggested, that early schooling, very important, early nutrition, very important. All that is early comes locally. It's only when you grow up that you go out into the big cities and into the big universities, but you're made for life way before that. And so how do you get a nurturing environment? Professor Chetty from Harvard has done a lot of work saying even in a vibrant first world economy like the United States, where you grow up matters hugely in your life chances. So if we want equality later on, you need to build those equal chances up front, which is why we need to work at the community level. I want to think of virtual communities as adding to this, and we do necessarily need to think about what the community of the future would look like. Some portion of it will be virtual, some portion of it will be physical, but it's hard to imagine that governance will be virtual, at least for some time. And so a lot of the governance will be local, which is why we need to focus on that.
Yeah.
That's even true within firms, that proximity, physical proximity matters.
Yes.
I seem to remember a study at Google showing that the best predictor of the ideas in teams in Google was who was sitting near whom. And Zooms work fine when you know somebody. They're not much good at getting to know somebody.
No. So physical proximity matters. We know that by now, by half a year of COVID online meetings, we know that the brainstorm capacity drops dramatically everywhere. So thank you for adding that. That is important. We have a question from the audience, from Ton Otten, who is actually wanting to explore an aspect of this. And he asks, is it reasonable to expect that rural communities are able to move into other areas, for instance, in the service economy, make them much stronger, right? Or should something else be done to push these communities forward? So it's a bit on the elaborate, how can we create stronger, economically stronger communities? Mr. Rajan, perhaps first?
Well, I think we have, again, COVID has given us a nice experiment. So much can be done at a distance. And so it does allow us to think about the possibility that maybe everybody doesn't need to live in the city. Now, Paul, in his book, talks a lot about agglomeration economies. And this is just what we talked about, right? Yeah. Proximity leads to better ideas. So that, on the one hand, enhances strong communities, but on the other hand, weakens weaker communities, because you get the secession of the successful. They want to go and live in the strong community rather than the weak community. And this is where I think the capacity to do business at a distance, even though not exactly of the same quality, but allows you to make a trade-off which could spell better news for those rural areas. Because now, do I really want to live in the big city if I can still do my job there, but I can have a nice big open expanse at a much cheaper price in that semi-rural community, and take the train maybe once a week into the job, but 4 days a week I breathe the fresh air of the rural area. And as more people like me do that, we spread economic activity around. So I do think that technology, while on the one hand contributing to the problem, may also be the source of solutions that we are all, developed economies are 85% service jobs or 80% service jobs. If those service jobs, especially the highest, be done at a distance, the higher skilled people can move across the country rather than all locating in London or in Amsterdam, and as a result, spread economic activity. That has to be one of the answers. And how do we increase that? That really is a question we need to think about.
Yeah.
Can I just build on that? Because I think we can't pretend that anybody can live anywhere they like and still be highly productive. But we can do something that stops it being the story that if you want to be productive, the only place you've got to go is the metropolis, which in my own country of Britain, that is the bitter reality at the moment.
Yeah.
London is 70% more productive than the rest of the country. As Professor Rajan said, the Brexit mutiny wasn't really a mutiny against Brussels. It only has 1% of GDP. It was a mutiny against London because everything is concentrated there. We're the most highly spatially concentrated government in the Western world. It's all in Whitehall in London. Yeah. And all the finance is concentrated in London as well.
Of course. So then Professor Govert Buys has an interesting question, because he's actually asking you whether Trump, the maverick one of you mentioned, is in a way restoring a sense of community or being cared for in a globalized world, because apart from the oddities, I quote Professor Buys, it's of Trump, it's a real answer to be found along the lines of having more conscious balance between globalization and protectionism. The jobs back to the states. He says he does that. So what is your response to that? Is Trump in a way also trying to deal with this in his matter to solve this question?
Paul, you want to go? I'll go after you.
All right.
I'm happy to go.
Snake oil is snake oil, first of all. He's doing exactly the wrong things. He's trying to push back the economic globalization, which is generating a lot of benefit, without proper policies that actually genuinely address community.
Okay.
So no.
Okay, clear. I don't want to mess up the time. Mr. Rajan, you probably concur with that. So I would like to go to the other aspect of both of your analysis, which is that for thriving communities, you need that localism, that principle of subsidiarity in decision making, right? I interviewed when he was still alive, Mr. Benjamin Barber, on when mayors would rule the world, right? Also a passionate statement on localizing policy making. And of course, both of you make an analysis that is really necessary, away from London, away from Basel, away from Brussels. Why is that necessary if we want to reimagine capitalism?
Well, I mean, really, because I think to all the things that Paul has said, that the solutions lie locally. You've got very different problems in say, Mumbai from the problems in Bangalore, from the problems in a village, and that applies across the world. So localism allows you to tackle the problems locally. Of course, there are national problems. You're not going to have emission standards for cars determined at the village level. That makes no sense. But if you want to think about, opening hours for shops, perhaps that is a local decision because they have different concerns, they have different holidays, they have different timings when people are working. So that localization could be very, very useful. The other thing is local empowerment in this age of globalization helps contribute to people's sense that they can actually do something. One of the biggest frustrations is I can't do anything about it because I have nothing to influence. So even if they make mistakes, even if they choose the wrong thing, it is them choosing. And that itself can be a benefit at this point. Last point, and I'll shut up. One of the dangers going forward, you talked about President Trump. He's talking about this imaginary national majoritarian community. There are two problems with that. One, it typically requires outside enemies to hold it together because there's nothing else holding it together. And if the old enemies don't work, new ones are created. And we've seen that evolve even as this administration's term has evolved. That's not a profitable way to go for the world, especially if we have to all live together because we become enemies at some point. But the other problem is that involves a centralization of power. And think of, many of the solutions that we suggest, for example, universal basic income to deal with technology. That means that effectively everybody will be paid by the government. Well, if that government is centralized, it has enormous power. We need a check and balance on that government. Localism is a check and balance because localism decentralizes the process, political power gets decentralized, and that can hold up to central power. You see it in the United States today, where a number of sanctuary cities will not enforce the immigration sort of laws imposed by the government. We can debate how much that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it does reflect there is a check and balance politically on the central government.
Raghu, can I jump in and just build on that with I'm going to chance my arm since it's late in the day and talk about Germany. Germany is a federal system, and so the regions have a lot of power. And in West Germany, there is no dominant city. You look around West Germany, the people in Hamburg don't wish they were in Berlin, the people in Frankfurt, the people in Munich, in Stuttgart, in Cologne. It's a widely distributed dignity as well as economic success. There's agency in every region. But as you said, East Germany hasn't worked. Why? Well, two things, I think. One is East Germany, there was an attempt to develop it from Berlin. And so it was done to East Germany, not by East Germany. And there's one reason why it couldn't be done by East Germany was that local agency had been destroyed under the GDR. There was no capacity, there was no tradition of community trust. The Stasi built a system where you couldn't trust anybody in East Germany. And so the very capacity to have community had been destroyed. But some German is sure to jump in and tell me that's completely wrong.
Clear. You wanted to.
Yeah, Mr. Collier, just one final question for you. Reading your book, I it seemed to me that you emphasize your ideas come from a kind of tradition with respect to the commons, which is really a United Kingdom kind of tradition. And I was wondering, in Europe, we have more of a different tradition, for example, more Rhineland-achtig kind of idea. What can we learn, nonetheless, from your views from that tradition within the context of Europe? Can we transpose those ideas one-on-one, or is there something different in store for Europe?
Look, I think the sense of community, we're hardwired for it. We've evolved to work to bond in communities. So our different traditions are themselves a source of interest and strength. A couple of years ago, I got the communitarian citizenship prize from the Belgian cooperative movement. I was very proud of that. And I asked them, how did the cooperative movement start in Belgium? It's huge, and it's one of the very few institutions in Belgium that works across the language groups. And they said, oh, it was simple. A team came over from Rochdale to teach us. What was Rochdale? It was a city in the north of England that in the 1840s was crushed by tragedy, and families came together and invented mutual obligations, the cooperative movement in Rochdale. They were called the Rochdale Pioneers, and it spread globally because it's such a naturally good idea. So we've got different cultural traditions, but we've got a common core, which evolution has endowed us with, and it says community.
Yeah. We get like a million questions still left. I mean, I would love to elaborate on the question on how this commons and cooperative movement can also help get away with this social stratification. But we're not going to go into that. We have a final question from Evelien Verhagen, who, thank you for watching, Evelien. You've sent us many very intellectual, very wise questions. One of her last question is about the relationship between the EU policy. She says, how can the EU balance the tendency towards its higher aspired level of harmonization, for instance, with the Green Deal at a higher level, and combine that with your, analysis that we need more localism?
Yeah, great question. I mean, take a policy which seems natural at the international level rather than at the local level, right? Dealing with climate change. The problem, of course, is if the policy is determined solely by bureaucrats without public input, you can get a reaction like we saw in France.
Yeah.
The Gilets jaunes were basically protesting hikes in gas prices, in petrol prices,
yes,
saying, you guys don't travel, we travel, and we pay a big chunk of our incomes because we have to travel a lot. In other words, this was done without broader consultation. Doesn't mean that every last policy needs broad national consultation before it's rolled out, but you got to talk to people and find out, what is acceptable, make the case, and then go and agree to it at an international level. Similarly, when we're talking about Green New Deal, I think it is important to go in that direction. But I would not say you will get EU funds if you do A, B, C, D, E, F. But in a sense, let countries determine how they will use a broad set of criteria. The broad set of criteria is to get it to move in the right direction. This is not spent in other ways. But then within that, as much freedom as possible for countries to determine what they do. And that's broadly, I think, the answer we need to look for. Not overly centralized, not overly decentralized.
Clear. A balance act. Yeah, and also, of course, a dialogue I hear you mention, which was already mentioned by Mr. Collier, right? I'm going to ask Sam de Muijnck to join us now for the end of this session. Thank you so much for your answers up until now. Sam, welcome back at the table. You kickstarted the conversation where you were, making an analysis and we tried to, we talked to these two gentlemen. What is your first reaction? What is your reflection on what you heard upon your own questions?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of things that clarified for me the issues a bit more. And one question that, however, remains for me is how do we really value the work that is so crucial for societies? I'm thinking of paid work, so being a teacher, being a nurse, also now, of course, with this pandemic, we see how important that is. But I think also a lot of the unpaid work. So if we talk about the education of kids, especially before they go to school, this is often done by mothers, not fathers, unpaid. And in today's world, this is not valued, it's not so much rewarded, and we, I think, also enable it too little. But I think it's a difficult question of how to solve it. But since you are both really esteemed economists, I would want to ask you guys this difficult question.
Okay, so let me try to put it in a context. You say this work is really important for thriving communities.
Yes.
And if we talk about thriving communities, we also have to talk about what work is necessary for that,
yes.
and what is the relation between the formal economy and that very important work for thriving communities.
Yeah, and I think it's in both the formal and the informal economy undervalued.
Clear. Mr. Rajan, would you like to respond to that?
Look, it's a difficult issue. I mean, certainly more funds at the local level can create jobs that go in the right direction. I do want to say, and this is to the point that Professor Collier has also made, that communities are also about informal obligations.
Yes.
You can't pay for everything. If you pay for everything, you may actually reduce the value. Let me give you an example. The elderly are lonely. Should we pay somebody to look in on them every so often? And that would be actually, lots of people who have social empathy but may not have a PhD in physics. And could well provide some of that community glue.
Yes.
But there is a danger in paying them to look in on somebody because that somebody knows they're being paid to look in on me. This is their job. They're not doing it out of kindness.
Yes.
So how do you create this job in a way that it is not so much in your face and actually builds the glue? And it may be that they're responsible for broader community activities, but they also are meant to check in on the elderly and just make sure that somebody's looking in on them. So they're not paid directly for this, but it becomes an indirect form of support.
And it becomes the consequence. Yeah, it becomes the consequence of what Mr. Collier said, shared or a common obligation. Mr. Collier, would you like to respond?
Well, I just want to build on that. I think it's absolutely right. We need widely distributed moral load bearing across our society. The tragedy is we've ended up with state and individuals and nothing else.
Yes.
And the obligations have gone up to the state, including ridiculous obligations, such as the loneliness of old people. All the individuals are detached from obligations, most especially the successful individuals. Leaving a load of obligations that should be done within families, within ordinary local civil society organizations, or indeed within firms. These firms are communities just like places.
Clear.
And so the people in those firms can have purposes beyond just making money. But whereas I agree with you that we don't want firms to be tasked with everything under the sun. They're not government. But that sense of widely distributed purpose and moral load bearing across society, that's communitarianism. That's what we need to get back to.
Yes.
There's a very good communitarian book that's just come out by a non-economist called Michael Sandel, called The Tyranny of Merit, which is actually very pertinent to this issue.
Yes, everybody's nodding here. Yeah.
Yeah, we can't just confine dignity to high earnings.
Clear.
That's a crushing reductionism.
Clear, thank you so much. That's the risk of asking these gentlemen, guys, as you mentioned them, a question. Your 5 minutes now, you gave them away, of course, and I would give them away as well to these brilliant minds, I can imagine. But let's see if we can continue the conversation the coming weeks, because I think you've touched upon something really important that we have to also keep in mind if we want to reimagine capitalism. So let me just say thank you to all three of you from us. Thank you for all your online questions, to all the people who participated. And next week we will be back with the 4th edition of this series. And then we will talk to Isabel Ferreiras and Josh Ryan Collins on precariousness of housing and work-life balance. Yes, it's one red thread our conversation. Thank you so much. Find coming editions of the series online through deswijger.nl. And for more information on Future Markets Consultation, which is this part of this program, go to moralmarkets.org/future markets consultation. It was an honor to have you as a kickstarter of the conversation, and the both of you from your beautiful rooms in your house or in your workplace. For Mr. Collier, I can't really see it. What? From home? Work. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us in this interesting consultation we are trying to have and organize with the brilliant minds of today. Thank you for your participation again, and thank you for watching, and hope to see you next week.